Hello everyone, welcome to this presentation. If you can please take your seats, then we can get started and make sure we keep everything on time. Actually, maybe if you'd also all like to move forward, just so we're all a bit closer together, that would be good. If you're not too full from scones. So welcome and thank you for joining us for this panel discussion on Indigenous and Community Conserved Areas, or ICCAs. We have 5 panellists with us this morning, 4 panellists and a chair, which are Dr. Taghi Farvar from Iran, Mr. Giovanni Reyes from the Philippines, Mr. Sudeep Jana from Nepal, and Dr. Dermot Smyth from Australia. And this discussion will be chaired by Chrissy, who is also from Australia. The presentation is called Networking for the Respectful and Appropriate Recognitions of ICCAs. And there's been a bit of a confusion about whether the launch of the toolkit will be in this room or in the Network Hub following this, but there's been a change and it'll actually be in this room at 12:15. And also I've been told to please ask you if you have any questions to please come down to these 2 microphones at the front and just line up there and you can ask your questions at the end. So without anything else to say, yeah, please welcome the panellists and the chair, Chrissy Grant. Thank you.
Thank you. Just to outline the format of this session, each speaker will speak and give their presentation from their country on ICCAs and IPAs, and then we're hoping to have 10 to 15 minute time slot for questions before the launch of the ICCA toolkit. So I will welcome Taghi, Dr. Taghi Farvar from Iran to start the proceedings.
Good noon almost. Since I'm assuming that most of you or nearly all of you were present earlier when I was the last keynote speaker, I'm going to rush through some of these and try to concentrate on some of the more essential issues that may not have been covered as much in depth. So we're talking about ICCAs. You already know what they are. They're Indigenous peoples and local communities, conservation territories and areas. And the ICCA Consortium, which has some examples, experiences, and ideas to present to you. We're talking about their recognition, but appropriate recognition and respectful recognition. ICCAs, I told you what they stand for. These are the biocultural diversity jewels of the world. There's the definition by IUCN, and there's the 3 characteristics: a community having de facto or legal, whatever, jurisdiction over a territory, and taking decisions, being able to take decisions about the territory, and these decisions resulting in the conservation of nature. So this is a review. They're found everywhere. They're the oldest form of conservation on Earth, much older and much more widespread than what governments and technocrats have been able to do. The threats that they're under, from everything from mismanagement to nationalization to evictions and the destruction of the institutions and institutional capability for managing and governing these jewels of biocultural diversity. And Indigenous peoples respond to them. by coming together, by strengthening themselves, by insisting on being recognized. And I'd like to, little by little, come to these are all the products of this thing. I borrowed them from the morning presentation, the website, and so forth. And what I want to come to a little bit is some examples. I'll talk about examples from Iran, and my colleagues will talk about examples from some of the other countries. In Iran, we have 3 consortium members. One of them is Senesta, which is the NGO that I chair. And that one was one of the founding members of the consortium. 2 of the ones that are recently have become members. One is UniNomad, which is the Union of Nomadic, Indigenous Nomadic Tribes of Iran, and the other is UniCamel, which is the Union of Indigenous Camel Herders of Iran. And when I say camel in Australia, I guess I have to be very careful, and I have to almost hide, because I happen to be a camel freak, almost a camel worshipper, because camels are considered a sacred animal in our land, in Iran and all the lands around it, whether they're Arab countries, Afghanistan, Pakistan, etc., and the Central Asian lands. And so what I understand is that some people from our region were brought with camels to this country by the British colonialists in order to be able to cross the desert easily. And when they served very well and faithfully, as camels always do, and when the railways came, the camel herders got the instructions to kill the camels and destroy them. And these being sacred animals, how could they do that? So they helped them gently become feral. And I understand you have something like between 1 and 1.5 million camels here. So I would consider you lucky, but I hear an unbelievable word applied to them like pests. So I sometimes say that I've come to this country to save the people from the camels and the camels from the people. These are many examples of ICCAs in Iran. On the bottom middle, you find what I refer to as a camel ICCA. It's actually the camels that are keeping that. And I think if I were Australia, I'm not, of course, I would declare all the camel areas a camel ICCA and respect it, but that's okay. All right, I'm, I think, done with it. Let me just tell you one thing about what we're doing in Iran. In Iran, there are 700 independent nomadic tribes, of which 100 are independent tribes and another 100 are tribal confederacies, much larger combinations of tribes. And what they're doing, because we consider every single territory of a nomadic people. A territory includes summering grounds, wintering grounds, the tribal migratory route, and all the resting stops in between. These are traditionally managed very well, while the government has claimed now nationalization over these lands. Still, the nomadic people are so resilient that despite the fact that they have been mistreated, forced into sedentarization and so forth, yet their resilience has made for the fact that their absolute numbers have remained roughly and dynamically the same throughout contemporary history. And that's because they understand the concept of carrying capacity, the carrying capacity of land, which is very different from a technocratic carrying capacity. They have a marvelous way of managing the rangelands and keeping them alive year after year. I think I'll hand it over to my colleague.
Good morning, fellow Earth peoples. I'm Giovanni Reyes from the National Coalition of Indigenous Peoples in the Philippines. It's one of the two largest networks we have founded 15 years ago. First, the location of our indigenous community conserved areas in the Philippines are located in northern Luzon, in central Luzon, or the island groups, and in southern Mindanao, there. So we have a total of 110 ethnic groups spanning 7 million hectares of ancestral domains. Since conservation is too big a problem for indigenous communities to handle alone, and since our traditional governance contributed much to the current depth of biodiversity, but hardly have a voice in national decision-making, we geared towards multi-sectoral collaboration with like-minded NGOs, global consortiums, the ICCA Consortium, the academe, especially the University of the Philippines, and government agencies in order to close the yawning gap. We launched 3 subnational conferences that culminated in a national conference with policy support from the Senate, from the lower house, and from the United Nations Convention on Biodiversity through John Scott, a member of the Iningay Indigenous Peoples of Barcaldine, Queensland, Australia. And 2 of our IP leaders here, who are here with us today, represent the 2 of the country's ICCA models that we have registered at the United Nations Environmental Program. Like their co-leaders back home, they struggled through harassments, death threats, and experienced face-to-face confrontation with armed elements of private sector plunderers and development aggression for the past 20 years. They are the reasons for our ICCAs in the Philippines. Please welcome Salvador Dimain and Johnny Gina. Unfortunately, our friend from the Coron Islands couldn't make it. Our ICCA process evolved in translating results of subnational events into draft guidelines and action plans that were subjected to plenary review. From the subnational, we subjected our draft guidelines to a plenary review and then approved. Spiraling bottom up, the guidelines were affirmed at national levels. The consolidated version of both national and national conferences evolved into a declaration otherwise known as the 2012 ICCA Manila Declaration. The ICCA simply emphasizes our rights to ancestral domains and outlines the roles of indigenous communities, government, and civil society. And just to mention one role each per sector. For indigenous communities, they shall prepare plans for the effective management of their ICCAs. We are of the belief that no matter how a plan is designed, because it purports to have the interest of indigenous peoples at heart, this can never work as effectively. It will only result in adversity and resistance. There is no substitute to a knowledge honed and refined by many generations of coming to terms with a rough environment. After all, indigenous peoples' lifestyle and practices are all built-in controls that precisely prevent the abuse and overutilization of our spaces. For government, they should view ICCA as a strategy for protection, management, development, and peace building, and not to hand over our resources to private corporate interests who are accountable only to the state and not to owners of ICCAs. For support groups, they should strengthen the involvement and inclusion of indigenous peoples and their support groups. The declaration also authorized our organization, the National Coalition of Indigenous Peoples, to form an ICCA network which we accomplished during the first quarter of this year in February. The network seeks to document and map all ICCAs, whether officially recognized or not, or whether under threat or not, for as long as there are areas long held by indigenous communities as their ICCAs since time immemorial. Our experience traversed to Taiwan, particularly Southeast Taiwan, with whom the Cordillera peoples of northern Philippines share common ancestry of Malayo-Polynesian ethnicity. Soon, at least 4 indigenous peoples' communities will organize and mobilize towards a federation for the recognition of traditional territorial rights in Taiwan. Beyond the Philippines and Taiwan ICCA relations, we hope to involve ethnic groups from southern Japan, South Korea, Taiwan, and the Philippines in order to build an East Asia ICCA corridor. This corridor will complement the global ICCA movement headed none other by our current president, Mr. Taghi Farvar. Thank you. Thank you very much.
Good morning. My name's Dermot Smyth, and I would like to acknowledge and thank the Larrakia people for their welcome to country. And it's the use of country as the basis for planning, particularly for Indigenous protected areas, that I want to talk about today. I've only got 7 minutes, so I'm going to rush through this, and I hope we'll get a chance to discuss it in more detail afterwards. So this is just an approximation of a map of Indigenous language areas, the country of different language speakers in Australia. The map in detail may not be accurate, but it certainly gives an impression of a country filled with, a nation filled with the countries of many different Indigenous people. And if you look at in more detail at a local level, especially in a coastal area, that each individual language area is divided up into smaller clan estates. And these dotted lines are, again, just an approximation. The actual clan estate arrangements is much more complicated than that. Now, so that was the situation before British invasion and colonisation. This is an approximation of the current land tenure under the Australian legal system of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander owned land, those black hatched areas. Now, I want to talk about this relationship of land tenure on one hand and country at another level in respect to Indigenous protected areas. We've heard quite a bit about Indigenous protected areas in the last few days. So I just want to remind you what an IPA is. It's an area of land and or sea dedicated or declared as a protected area by Indigenous people themselves, not by government, but recognised by government as part of the Australia's National Reserve System of protected areas. They are managed by legal and other effective means, a combination of processes, and most of them up until recently have been based on Aboriginal ownership or tenure under the Australian legal system. But what I want to just, share with you is recent developments that have moved from IPAs based on tenure to IPAs based on this idea of country, traditional Indigenous estates. So this is a map, a recent map. The areas in red show the Indigenous protected areas. We've heard earlier there's about 56 of them and about another 40 currently being developed. And almost all of those red areas, those IPAs, are based on Aboriginal tenure, Aboriginal ownership of their land under the Australian legal system. Now, if we want to talk about IPAs based on country, what are they? So I'd say they are areas determined by the cultural affiliation of people to the land and sea, and therefore could include multiple tenures under the legal system, not just Aboriginal-owned land, but other tenures within a particular country. They're consistent with international guidelines on protected areas. And in the multiple tenure parts of a country-based IPA, there is a commitment by the other interest groups to collaborate on achieving the IPA goals through a negotiated co-governance arrangements. And then, just like all the other tenure-based IPAs, there is recognition and support by governments and other interested groups. So I want to just talk a bit about what, if you're thinking of one particular clan estate, what the opportunities provided by an IPA based on tenure. So you might have within one country or one clan estate, because of colonial processes and histories and dispossession and repossession and land claims, you might have only a small bit of land that is now owned by the traditional owners under the Australian legal system, a very small proportion of their original clan estate. And no ownership of the sea. And then next door you might have a national park, you might have a forest reserve, and you might have a marine park. Now, under a tenure-based IPA, the only part of that clan estate that is likely to be recognised as an Indigenous protected area is the small area, the red area, the Aboriginal land. And the other areas, very often managed by different agencies, in this case maybe 3 different agencies, and the opportunities for co-management with Aboriginal people vary greatly across the country from state to state and territory to territory. So in this situation, it's only that small area is an Indigenous protected area. For a country-based IPA, the opportunity is for the IPA to spread over all of those protected area tenures, and the Indigenous protected area is then used as a pathway to co-manage and collaborate in the management of those other areas under the umbrella of an Indigenous protected area. There may be other opportunities also, for example, in pastoral lands, there may be opportunities for some of those to be brought into an Indigenous protected area. And we now have, as of a couple of years ago, we now have several Indigenous protected areas that are based on this model of multiple tenures, an Indigenous-led process of creating an Indigenous protected area with collaboration of other tenure holders and managers. And I want to finish up by talking about a very recent development which some of you may have witnessed on the first day of this conference, which was the recognition by the Australian government and the Northern Territory government of an addition to the Dimaru Indigenous protected area in northeast Arnhem Land. If I can get this to work. Does this work? Yeah, here we go. So this small area in the middle, the hatched area, was an Indigenous protected area declared in the year 2000, and it did include a small area of sea country or marine area that had been registered as a marine sacred site. But most of the sea country, the marine parts of traditional estates had not been included in the Indigenous protected area. Last month in Arnhem Land, traditional owners had a ceremony to dedicate and include their sea country in the IPA, and on Sunday at the front of this building, those 2 levels of government formally recognised the addition of the sea country to the IPA. That's a satellite photograph of the now integrated land and sea Indigenous protected area, properly putting land and sea together as one management unit. The innovations of this country-based approach to Indigenous protected area, I'll just summarise in this way, saying that the process is led by traditional owners or Indigenous people. It's allowing the re-emergence of country, the concept of country, as an ancient scale of management and governance of natural and cultural resources, the re-emergence of that scale in the 21st century. And it allows integrated management between land and sea within each IPA and also between neighbouring IPAs. And in areas where traditional owners don't have full ownership, for example in the marine areas at the moment, then there is co-governance through a commitment to the IPA goals by their various collaborating agencies and stakeholders, which could include, for example, fisheries management agencies, commercial fisher organisations, recreational fisher organisations, etc., etc. The way we describe it in the management plan for this area is that each of those collaborators brings with them a backpack of authority and commitment and capacity, which they share with the traditional owners to collectively manage that area. And again, you have that package of legal and other effective means. And again, you have recognition and support by all levels of government that this package is a legitimate, internationally recognised protected area. And finally, just some thoughts on the benefits and challenges of these arrangements. The benefits include this conservation across landscape and seascape. A combination of natural values and cultural values are protected. There is multi-party support and involvement, which can be a challenge, but it also potentially involves greater access to resources and support. And it provides a platform for cross-cultural collaboration. Among the challenges is that it's up to the traditional owners to maintain this collaboration. It's a traditional owner-led process, and it will be up to them to maintain that collaboration. There's a question over time of cultural change. If culture changed significantly, will the priorities of that traditional owner group remain committed to those goals? We don't know the future, but we do know, certainly since the beginning of the Indigenous protected areas 15 years ago, even though that these arrangements are voluntary arrangements, the commitment to protecting natural and cultural values has only grown and grown. So personally, I don't feel cultural change will be a threat to this process, but it's legitimate to ask that question. Likewise, what will be the recognition of the protected area status, particularly of the sea country component of Indigenous protected areas? We have had recognition by governments that this is a legitimate, internationally recognised protected area. We don't know yet whether it'll be included in Australia's National Reserve System of Marine Protected Areas. That's something to be discussed. And finally, in the context of this little workshop, what is the connection between IPAs and ICCAs that we've heard about so much and so elegantly this morning? And I'll just say two things about this. I think there is a lot in common, obviously, between IPAs and ICCAs. From a personal point of view, I would like to see IPAs, however, only recognised as ICCAs with the prior informed consent of the Indigenous protected areas individually, rather than all of them being labelled as ICCAs without that discussion first being had. And secondly, if you look at the three criteria for ICCAs, the issue of the collaborative management of some of the IPAs may not be consistent with the current definition of an ICCA. I'll leave it there. Thanks very much.
Let me briefly share our experiences from Nepal. For many of you, Nepal is a small landlocked country. We don't have sea, so it's only land managers. Unfortunately, we are landlocked, sandwiched between India and China. Very small, but very pioneering and emerging initiative to promote and advance works on ICCAs in Nepal. And my 5-minute talk is on behalf of the ICCA Network Nepal leaders who unfortunately could not make it through this conference, and the organization I'm also affiliated with, it's Forest Action. Just to give you a sense of the diversity of various types of ICCAs in the context of Nepal, representing different ecoregions, different ecosystems. As you can see, it ranges from a very tiny sacred grove, sacred wetlands, to a much larger landscape, the cultural landscape, the sacred landscape. And within this small emerging network, currently there are it represents 29 different sites and the community institutions, sacred forest, wetlands, community managed forests. I think community managed forests are one of the biggest movement in terms of community-oriented managed forest conservation. I mean, more than 16,000 such forest users group in the context of Nepal. We have some experiences of community-based protected areas who are also the part of this network, and community-managed protected area, which is entirely managed by local communities. And definitely there's more from a cultural dimension of indigenous people, treating the entire sacred landscape where some of the customary territory and practices are still going on, but increasingly under threat. So it's a small network, slowly emerging, currently represents 29 different sites. So this is the journey that actually began in 2009 as a part of a South Asian level study and dialogues that I was also involved with, and so which is much before the birth of Consortium. So it was a part of the South Asia sort of regional process. This study actually envisaged and documented various ICCAs in its diversity in the context of Nepal. Then all the way from 2009 to 2012, we have a series of national conferences and dialogues that actually endorse this whole idea of having an ICCA network in the context of Nepal. So this shows a slow but very powerful evolution of this small network in Nepal. So these are some of the actions this emerging network is actually involved with, along partnering with various civil society organizations and groups, including the ICCA Consortium, in organizing national gatherings every 1 or 2 years, mainly involved in a lot of rights-based advocacy, because the context of Nepal, especially the legal regimes, do not the legal and the policy regime do not support ICCAs, although it has various sectoral natural resource laws and policies that encourage community-based conservation and natural resource management. So the leaders of the ICCA networks are very much proactive in terms of lobbying and advocating for the recognition and the policy space for ICCAs in Nepal. A lot of multi-stakeholder policy dialogue, including politicians, a lot of conservation authority and actors, and a bit of sort of involved in case studies and publication to sort of articulate the best practices in the context of Nepal. And it's not only the national thing, it actually sort of evolved through a lot of regional processes in the context of Nepal. So to present before you some of the key lessons that is coming out of this experience, personally being involved from the birth of this ICCA network in the context of Nepal, given my own ethnographic encounters with these ICCA leaders in Nepal, they perceive this entire process as very empowering, because given their small-scale conservation initiative never got a national sort of recognition and a voice, but being a part of this emerging network, it is very much an empowering process for the members of the ICCA network Nepal. And definitely, it's been one of the very much effective and powerful strategy to advocate recognition and support to ICCAs in Nepal. And one of the things that I really want to stress is, without romanticizing this whole notion of ICCAs and experiences, which looks very easy, but although Nepal has never been colonized, although neighboring India was colonized by British India, but we were lucky enough, but unfortunately we were internally colonized. So the whole initiatives, the historical processes of these kind of initiatives by indigenous people and local communities has to be actually situated within the socio-political context of Nepal that actually trampled the rights of indigenous people, their customary institutions, common property resources. So this state and the indigenous people and local community relation is very much important, that has implication on these kind of initiatives. Given my own experiences, when we talk about innovations, a paradigm shift in protected areas or conservation, still there's quite a lot of resistance, especially from the conservation authorities. And I think this is actually triggered by this whole misconception about ICCAs, because especially the term indigenous in certain cultural context is very much perceived as a very divisive kind of a terminology, because although Nepal has around more than 30% of indigenous people, but this whole ethnic politics has become a very contentious issue. So I think this has been one of the major sort of challenge the network is actually currently facing, just even to discuss and bring in the various dialogue in a common platform to discuss about the strength of ICCAs. And very much they talk about the rhetorics of community-based conservation, community-based natural resource management, when it comes down to actually ensuring the governance authority and the issue of tenure to these initiatives, there's huge reluctance and resistance from the part of government authorities. But things are slowly changing because of these emerging initiatives and movement. Definitely, since the 2003 World Parks Congress, the huge paradigm shift in conservation, a lot of international policy processes where huge sense of rights for indigenous groups and local communities, and sort of this recognition that it's not only the government or the technocrats or the conservation groups that are the key actors, but it's the local communities and indigenous groups who are the key actors in conservation. But it definitely can be a very positive impetus to all these grassroots and national scenarios, but it's very challenging to actually have that international frameworks sort of its compliance on the domestic level. So I think this is one of the key challenges in that the ICCAs and the networks in different parts of the world are actually going to face. And as I said earlier, especially in the context of Nepal, this historical marginalization of the indigenous groups, the erosion of their customary practices, the loss of the territories. In fact, most of the high altitude national parks, I mean, all of you know about the Mount Everest, although it's very iconic sort of World Heritage site for many people, like tourists, but it was imposed on the territory of the Sherpa indigenous people. So it's still quite contentious issues, not recognizing the Mount Everest, the entire Mount Everest, as more of a sacred landscape rather than just a national park. So there is a huge lack of legal sort of recognition for ICCAs. There's historical marginalizations. The current emerging ethnic politics in the context of Nepal, the weak laws to actually ensure the rights of indigenous people, and the issue of tenure of the communities in terms of natural resources as one of the key challenges we are currently sort of facing at a moment. And that's why I think at the grassroots level, at the national level, and even a global level, it's actually a movement. It's actually an emerging sort of movement globally, nationally, at the grassroots, and definitely it sort of hints that we really need to engage in very persistent rights-based advocacy, a lot of partnership and collaboration upon multiple actors across multiple scales if you really want to pursue this wonderful journey and the struggle for these biocultural jewels of the world. So I would really like to thank many partners on behalf of the consortium for sort of directly and indirectly involved in organizing this particular event. And thank you very much for your attention.
I'd like to thank the panel. You've heard here some examples and overview of what's happening in different countries such as Iran, Philippines and Nepal, and the concept of country-based planning for IPAs in Australia. So, as Taghi had said in his earlier presentation, there are many, many more stories that could be told about ICCAs and the movement of the Indigenous and local peoples, communities, and working towards the management of their lands in their own country. So if there are any questions from the floor, I'd like to direct you to each of the microphones. Could you come to the microphone to hear?
Thank you very much. I'm Tahir Rashid from Pakistan, and I have two very short questions, one with Mr. Smyth and the second with Mr. Taghi. Mr. Smyth, it's a wonderful program you talked about, IPA. But day before yesterday, when we were in an award ceremony, so the gentleman really raised an apprehension that if the new government will come, so they will decide the fate of this IPA. So my question is, have you devised any sustainability strategy, how to sustain this IPA, because it's a wonderful program, so it should not be totally based on the government intervention or government's what you can say, type of input. Number two, and my question with Taghi Saab is, Taghi Saab, what type of synergies you foresee between the ICCA and this new WIN organization, and how we can complement each other in days to come? Thank you very much.
Right, thanks for the question about sustainable funding. One of the things that I always stress when I'm working with traditional owner groups in helping to plan Indigenous protected areas is to, I guess, emphasise that it is they, the traditional owners, who are dedicating their country as a protected area. It's a traditional owner, an Indigenous protected area. Now, at the moment, almost all the funding, especially in the early days of planning and management, comes from a government program called the Indigenous Protected Area Program. But I really like to make that distinction between IPAs, which are traditional owner, Indigenous entities, and the IPA program, which is a government funding and support program. And if you look at some of the Indigenous protected areas that have been going for many years, and I mentioned Dimaru earlier, that's added their sea country, but there are many others like this. If they've been running for some time, they usually put a lot of effort into building multiple partnerships and multiple sources of funding so that they don't depend only on the IPA program funding. And I guess the two other things I want to say is, one is that one of the benefits of a country-based approach to Indigenous protected areas is that it tends to bring in multiple partners. And even though it's more complex, it's also, in my view, more robust, because if the IPA program funding should disappear sometime in the future, you've still got your other partnerships holding it up. And secondly, the last 15 years in Australia tells us that we have two major sides of politics here, the Labor Party and the Conservative coalition. For the last 15 years, there's been changes of government, and both sides of government have strongly supported Indigenous protected areas, and the indication is that the funding will continue in a strong path. But I emphasise that it's still up to traditional owners to have an eye on the robustness of funding and build multiple partnerships. Thank you.
Tahir Sahib, I think the relationship obviously cannot be well defined now, especially since WIN is not yet a well-defined, gelled character. As it comes out, not only the ICCA Consortium, but many others can help define the relationships. WIN obviously is going to be, or has to be, not just a network of individuals, because Indigenous peoples are peoples, they're not individuals, right? And if it wants to have power, my God, power is a powerful P. If they want to have power of legitimacy, then it must be collections of collectives. I keep saying and repeating, Indigenous peoples and even local communities are not individuals, nor just collections of individuals. They're entities with culture, with history, with ways, with customs, with laws of their own that have existed for ever since time immemorial. The ICCA Consortium is one such body of primarily Indigenous peoples, but also of local communities, groups, and other collectives. The individuals that are in there are honorary members. They are there to advise, they're there to give their expertise and to support. So clearly, the consortium, I believe, I can speak as its president, stands ready to offer any kind of experience, support, advice, and benefit by experience, support, and advice. So it's a mutual relationship, but also I think the win, there are other things that are not yet completely well defined. What does it mean for a global network of indigenous peoples and local communities to be housed in a United Nations agency? I very much approve of that particular UN agency. It's one of the best. Not all UN agencies are nice and well-behaved, and some of them are noxious. They spread poisons and GMOs and everything else, okay, and bad ideas. However, the goodness of that does not necessarily presume that the process for getting there up to here and from here on, what it means and what it will be like. I think the process is much more important because it will determine a lot of the content. I have great hopes for that, but I also cannot hide my uneasiness unless the governance structure of this new being is such that it is really controlled from the grassroots. And to the extent that it is, obviously all grassroots groups will support it and will be strengthened by it and benefit by it. And at all times, I think there should be a cautionary principle of making sure that a network of networks of indigenous peoples is not subject to or planned by or facilitated by even a United Nations bureaucracy of any type, regardless of how benign and beautiful and useful it has been. So I don't think beyond that any of us can give anything but hopes and the resolve to make it succeed, because it has already taken a great deal of resources, human, financial, and commitments. We heard, I think we can't forget what the minister at the very beginning was saying with such passion about this. And I've talked to some of them since I've been here, and I think they're converted, they're convinced. But all that passion must translate into due process, good process, legitimate process. Legitimacy is much more important, I think, than legality even. And so I can only speak with hopes and dreams that it will go well, and we'll certainly do our best, we meaning many of you who are part of the network, to make it succeed, inshallah, as we say, God willing.
Thank you.